I want to show you how to make a responsive navigation element in your website. A nav bar is an important element. It allows one to navigate throughout the website. It allows users to directly access any page of the website. A navigation system can be designed in various formats. In this particular lesson, we're going to build out a simple but responsive nav bar using pure CSS. We'll be creating a hamburger menu icon that looks like this, and when it's clicked, the links for the page will show up. We can then close the hamburger icon by simply clicking on it. If the page reaches the media query, you can see that the layout in the navigation section changes a little bit, and the hamburger icon disappears since now we have plenty of room to display all of the navigational elements at the large screen size. So let's get into it and learn how we can create this responsive navigation bar. Here's what the page looks like so far, and this is the HTML that I'm using. You'll see that I have a meta viewport element, which of course is going to allow my page to be responsive. I'm linking out to my material icons CDN. I'm not using any icons on the web page yet, but we will be using them in our hamburger menu. I'm linking to a reset file, and I'm linking to my style.css. In regards to the HTML, I have a header element. It contains an H1, and the H1 contains a link with an image and some text. That's followed by a nav element that contains an unordered list with several list items. And then I have a main element, and I just simply have an article with some text on the page, just so we can have some content on the page. In regards to my starting CSS, I have some basic CSS styles that are just setting the font size and a couple of margin settings for most of my elements, as well as styling my links. Now that you know what I'm starting with, let's get into creating this. We'll start out by formatting our header section and making this look a little bit more navigational-ish. I'm going to make a rule for a header, and we'll set a background color. I'm going to use a display of flex on this element. And if we save now and we refresh, you can see that my elements are now going to sit side by side, as well as I have a gray background color. The next thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and just style some of the elements within the header. I'll make a rule for header H1, and I'm simply going to get rid of the margin bottom. I'm adding a margin bottom, which I do want for most of the page content, but on the navigation element, I don't want that, so I'll just remove that here. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to style my header H1A element. And for this element, I'm going to specify a color. We'll use a slightly different shade here. Next, I'm going to specify my font size, and I'm going to make that 3 which is slightly smaller than the H1 font size that I'm using elsewhere. I'll start off by declaring a rule for font size. We're going to set the font size here to be 3 rems. This is slightly smaller than the 4 rem size that I'm using on H1s elsewhere. I am also going to use a display of flex, and this is going to allow me to center align the logo and the text right here. So we're just going to use display flex, and we'll use align item center. And finally, I'm going to set margin, and my margin is going to be a 1/2 rem on the top and the bottom, and 1 rem on the right and the left. If we save now and refresh, you can see that these items are center aligned and have a little bit of spacing around them, which is what I want. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create some spacing between the image and the text. So we'll go ahead and we'll target our header A image, and I'm simply going to set margin on this element to be 0 on the top and the bottom. We'll do 1 rem for the right, 0 for the bottom, and 0 for the left. So if we save, you can see that I have a little bit of spacing. Now, I'm going to start working at my mobile first size, so this is going to be my small screen. Let me just open up my developer tools, and we'll just make this page even a little bit smaller, just so we can look at it. So I do not want my navigation to be displaying here. I want it displaying underneath this navigational bar, and we're going to actually end up moving the logo and the text over here on the right and have our hamburger menu appear over here on the left. So in order to position the nav element where I want, I'm going to use my position property. I'll go ahead and I'll set my position property to absolute, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set the top to 100%. Let's go ahead and let's add a background color to this element as well, and the background color is just going to be a slightly darker shade of gray. And in order to use my position absolute, I need to apply a position on one of its parent elements. So I'm going to come back up to my header, and we're going to add a position of fixed on this element. That way this element will always be visible at the top of the page. And just to ensure that nothing goes in front of it, I'm just going to set an Z index that's somewhat high. So I'll just use 100 for that. If we save now and we refresh, you can see that my navigation is going to appear directly underneath the rest of the content. That's because our top of 100%, it's letting this take up whatever it needs to, and then at 100% of this height, the height of the header, it will appear at the top of that. Now, I don't want this element to be all slammed over here on the left, nor do I want the header to be restricted to being on the left. So what we're going to do is we're going to come to the header and we'll add a width of 100%. And I'll do the same thing on nav. We'll add a width of 100%. And now you can see that these are taking up the entire width. Now, because these have a position of fixed and absolute, they are obscuring the rest of the content. But you also need to remember that our navigation element isn't going to always be showing. It's only going to show when you click the hamburger menu. So let's just not worry about that right now. We'll fix that up once we get the navigation all dialed in. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a rule for my Nav Li items. And for Nav Li, we're going to add some padding of 1 rem all the way around. On mobile devices, it's very important to give your user lots of room to be able to click the link, because remember, they're clicking with a finger, and fingers can be a little bigger than a mouse. You don't have quite as much control. So giving them plenty of space to be able to click something is really important. If I'm using a finger to touch this, that could be a little tricky, but now that I've added some spacing, it'll be much easier for me to be able to click along here and make sure that I am able to really target these elements and be able to click them. With that being said, let's go ahead and let's make a rule for our Nav LIA elements, and I'm just going to have these display as block. This will not change the way the nav looks at all, but now my user will be able to click the link over here on the right. They don't have to be right on top of the text, and that can definitely be important. And finally, I think I'm just going to make a rule for my Nav Hover. And of course, on a touchscreen, we don't have a hover. There's no way that we can actually target hovering, but I like to put this on here anyways, just in case someone is on a smaller screen on their computer or something like that. They will have the hover behavior. I'll specify color, and I'm going to use a slightly lighter shade for the hover state. We will not be able to see hover when we're in the responsive mode, so I'll need to just get out of the responsive mode. I'm going to just do that off screen. And now if I hover over any of these elements, you can see that they just changed to a slightly lighter shade of the teal. So we'll just leave that in there, even though this will not necessarily be for mobile. I'm going to toggle the device toolbar and go back into the responsive mode, and let's continue styling this. At this point, what I need to do is I need to create the hamburger item and add a little bit more to my HTML. So I'm going to go into my HTML, and we're going to use a method called the checkbox hack to be able to do this. This is an awesome way to create a responsive menu. It works really well across the board, and once you understand it, it's pretty easy to incorporate into your web projects. So what I'm going to do is right before my navigation element, I'm going to add an input element. Now, input elements are traditionally used for forms. We're going to be using a type of checkbox, which is going to allow us to create this behavior that we want for our responsive navigation element. I'm going to assign a class to this element, and the class that I'm going to give it is called Nav Toggler. In addition to having a class, I'm going to give it an ID with the same value. I tend to use classes in my CSS. We could just give the ID and use the ID, but I'm just going to leave both on here. It doesn't really hurt to have both, but if you wanted to, you could eliminate the class and simply use the ID. Now, we can just leave this here before we add the rest of the HTML. If we refresh, you're going to see that I get a little checkbox right here. So let me just leave this as is, and let's add some CSS to make this behavior work in the way that we want it to. So because we have the checkbox, we actually have a pseudo class that we can use to see if that element is checked or not, which is super helpful, and that is the pseudo class of checked. So I'm going to put .navToggler : checked, and that's going to check to see if this item is indeed checked. So if it is checked, then what we're going to do is we're going to use the tilde, and then I'm going to go ahead and add nav. Adding the tilde allows us to look for any preceding sibling. It doesn't necessarily have to be the sibling that immediately follows this particular element, but any sibling within the same parental item. So this will allow us to actually target the nav. That's what we want to target. And what we're going to do is, if the nav toggler is checked, we want the nav element to display as block. Now, by default, the nav element is displaying as block. So we're going to come up to our rule on nav right here, and by default, we're going to have it display as none. So this will turn the navigation off, and then when the checkbox is checked, it will turn it back on. So if we save our page and we come back here and refresh, you're going to see that the navigation disappears, and then when I click my checkbox, it appears, which is exactly what we want. So now, when I click the checkbox, the navigation opens. When I uncheck the checkbox, the navigation disappears. And this is the premise for the hamburger menu. Now, of course, we don't want a checkbox on our page, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to make this look a little bit more presentable, and we're going to doll it up a little bit. But this is the behavior that we want. So I just wanted to show you that before I added anything else, because I wanted to show you how simple it is to use this checkbox type of feature to build our hamburger menu. Let's go back into our HTML, and we're going to add a little bit of HTML to our code right here. What I'm going to do, and it doesn't really matter where in the header this goes, but I think it makes the most sense to put it underneath the nav element. I'm going to create a label element, and label elements are generally paired with input elements. So these traditionally are used more with forms, but we're going to use them here. So when we use a label, you need to tie the label to the input, especially because the label and the input are not sitting next to each other in the HTML code. We create this relationship by using a for value that matches the ID. So the ID of the input element needs to be exactly the same as the for attribute value. And this is what allows the label to be associated with this particular input field. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give a class to this element. And the class is just going to be Nav Toggler Menu. And then let's just give this a name attribute as well. The name attribute is not completely necessary, but it does help to associate the label with the input. So I'll just add that in there. I'm going to go ahead and inside the label, we're going to use some of our material icons. We talked about material icons in an earlier lesson. If you go to your material icon website and you search for hamburger, you'll see that there is an icon for the hamburger menu type of graphic. I'm going to click this. I'll copy this code right here, and I'm going to place this inside of the label. I've already explained how this code comes in a little sloppy, so I just like to clean it up. And I'm going to go ahead and, in addition to the class that is associated with this, I like to give my material icons a shorter name so that I can style them. So I'm going to give it an MI name for material icons. And in addition, I'm going to give a third class of menu open. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get a closed icon as well. So our closed icon is simply just going to be an X. So if I just search for X, here I have a little X. I'm going to use that. You could really use any of these graphics, you know, if you want a cancel or the highlight off or something. Well, maybe let's just use this one just to make it a little different. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this code. I'll come down here. I'll paste this in. I'll just go ahead and clean up the code a little bit. And then once again, I'm going to give this a class of MI. And we're also going to give this a class of menu close. If we save our page now and we go back to the page that we're working on and refresh, you'll see that here are my two material icon graphics. So they're showing up right here. Clearly, we do not want them showing up right here. So we're going to have to use some CSS magic to be able to style these in the way that we want. So let's jump into our CSS. The first thing I'm going to do is assign a color value to the material icon elements. This will allow me to have the style match my website. So I'm going to use a teal color and you can see how that instantly changes. And then what we're going to want to do is we don't want the close to be showing. So let's just make a rule for .menu close. And we're simply just going to tell the display to be none. That will hide the close element so that it is not showing. And the other thing that we want to do is we don't want the checkbox to show. So let's just hide that. And we're going to do the same sort of thing. We're going to use nav toggler display none. If we hide that and we just have the menu, you can see that I can click on the little hamburger menu and it still works in the same functionality. And that's because the material icon, the hamburger menu icon, is inside the label and that is tied to the checkbox. So that is allowing us to control the checkbox with this little hamburger menu. Now we're simply going to use some CSS to get this to be positioned over here on the left. In order to do that, I'm going to use for my selector my nav toggler menu, which is the class that I applied onto the label. And now that I see this, I can see that I actually didn't spell it correctly. So let me correct that real quick or my CSS won't work. And now that we've done that, we'll go ahead and we'll, first of all, just add a border so we can kind of see what's going on. I like to work with just a red border or something just so I can see where something is. I mean, obviously you can see where it is, but it's easier once you start using some other rules and whatnot. And to get this to be on the left, what we're going to do is we're going to use a position, and we'll use position of absolute. I'm going to specify that I want the top value to be 0 and I want the left value to be 1 rem, so it's not right against the edge. And now if I refresh, you can see it positions it here. Because I'm using position absolute, the height has kind of shrunk a little bit. So let's give it a full height, and we'll use 100% to do that. And then I am going to use display flex. And the only reason I'm using display flex is so I can align this in the middle by using our align items center. And that should position the hamburger menu in the middle, which it does. So that's kind of where this now exists. We'll just leave the border on for a couple minutes. Ultimately, we'll be getting rid of that. So this is now positioned where I want it to be. It functions in the way that I want it to function. So that part's working great. The next thing that I want to do is I want to move this stuff over here, the logo and the text, over to the right. And what we're going to do to get this to appear on the right is we're going to go into our header element. We're already using a display of flex. And what we're going to do is we're just going to use a justify content, and we'll use end, which is going to push these elements over to the right, which is where we want them to be. Since this element is using a position of absolute, the flex is not going to affect it, which is what we want. So this is much better. And then what I'm going to do is I want the text to appear first and then the logo to appear on the right. So because this is using flex, I'm going to go into my header A image right here. And we already have a rule there. And we'll just simply specify a order of 1, which is higher than the default of 0, which is going to switch these around. And now that I've done that, I notice that I'm going to need a little bit of spacing on this left edge. So we'll just change the margin settings to be 0 for the top and 1 rem for the right and the left. And then we can just use 0 on the bottom as well. So that looks pretty good. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to switch out our icon. So when the menu is open, we don't want to display the hamburger menu anymore. We want to display our X, our little close menu. And we're going to do that. Let's come down here to the bottom. And what we're going to do is we're going to use something similar to what we did here, where we used our nav toggler checked. As a matter of fact, I'll just copy this and let's just put this down here. I'm going to target .nav toggler checked. Then we're going to use our tilde to get the sibling. And the sibling that we want is going to be the nav toggler menu. And what we really want to get right now is the menu close item that is a child of that. And we're simply going to have it use a display of block. So that will, when this item is checked, that will turn the close item off. And let's just copy this entire line of code. We also want the hamburger menu icon to disappear. So I'm going to go ahead and just change my selector to be nav toggler checked. And then we'll get a sibling that is nav toggle menu, and we'll get the child of menu open, and we'll just tell this to have a display of none. If we save now and refresh, here's our hamburger menu. When I click this, you can see it switches to the close icon. The navigation opens, and if I click that again, it toggles back to the hamburger menu. So this is working beautifully, exactly the way we want. Let's get rid of that border at this point. And there we go. We have our responsive menu. So that is working really well. And it's just pure CSS. We didn't have to use any fancy JavaScript or anything. It's pretty easy to use. And obviously you can style this in any way. You could obviously have your menu look differently just depending on your CSS. So that looks pretty good. The final thing that we're going to want to do here is we're going to want to address what happens at the large screen. So, I mean, this menu is going to continue to work at the large screen, but it just looks a little silly, and clearly we have a lot more room. So let's go ahead and let's add a media query, and let's adjust how the menu looks at the larger screen. So I'm going to use my media query, and again, it just depends on your project. I'm just going to use a min width of, we'll say 800 pixels, but you could adjust this as needed. And what we're going to do to begin with is we don't want that nav toggler menu to display at all. So we're going to hide the icon at the large screen, and we're simply going to use a display of none to do that. That's just going to hide the hamburger menu at the large screen. You can see it just goes away. And then what we're going to do is we are going to target our header, which is the parent of these elements. And instead of using the justify content end, I'm going to change this to justify content start. So that's going to then move the logo over here. And we want the logo first and then the text. So I need to switch the order. And I'm just kind of undoing some of the things that I had done before. So header a image. And we'll go ahead and we'll just set our order value to 0. So these things are going to be flipped. Then we have the logo and then the text like this. And then I'll go ahead and I'll address the navigation. Let's get the navigation back. So let's target the nav element. And what I'm going to use here is I'm going to use a property called all and set the value to unset. This is a little bit of a new property, and it does work in all modern browsers. If you're using older browsers, you want to be sure to check, and if this is problematic, you might need to use a different method listing all the properties out. But this is just a quick way that just gets rid of all of our nav rules. So all of these things get set back to the default values. So this is like saying display block, the width is just auto, the background color is going to be removed from this item, there's no position, etc., etc. So quicker just to write unset all. Then what we're going to do is we're going to use a margin left, and we're going to set our margin left to auto. We talked about this when we used flex. This is going to go ahead and take up this space, so it's going to move it over to the right, which is what we want. And let's go ahead and let's target our nav ul element For this, I'm going to have it display as flex because we don't want these items to appear stacked on top of each other. So display flex. And if we go ahead and do that, these items should sit side by side, which they do. I do want to center these. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use on my nav element a align self of center, which will allow me to align these elements to the center. Next, we're going to need to get rid of our border on these elements. And I guess I don't really need this on a separate line since I only have one rule right there. So I'm going to target my nav li items, and we're going to target our border bottom, and we'll just set that to none. And there you go. I think on the very last item right there, I want a little bit of space, so I'm actually going to just put this on the nav ul. I guess I do want that extra line returns after all. And we'll use a margin right, and let's just set that to 1 rem, just so the text doesn't go so close to the end. That'll give us a little bit of a buffer. So you can see when my page is smaller, here's my navigation, works great. Once my page hits that 800 pixel media query, then it's going to appear in a horizontal type of manner. And the only thing that, you might want to think of, like this works really well in kind of a small screen and to a mid screen. When it gets really large, you can see how my content gets pushed away. So there's a number of ways you could go about this. You might want to assign a background color on something other than the header so that we could give the header like a max size. At this point, if I give the header a max size, the background color isn't going to span all the way to the ends. I kind of want it to. So I think I'll just do one more media query for this particular example. And let's just set a min width of maybe 1200 pixels for this. And what we'll do here is we'll just target our header, and we're going to set the padding on the header, and let's make the padding 0 for the top and the bottom, and maybe we'll just use 20% for this example. And then I'm going to do something similar on main, which contains my content. So on main, we'll go ahead and we'll set the padding. And on main, I already have a padding of 125 on the top, which I want, so I'm just going to plug that in. We'll use 20% for the right and the left, and then I already had 50 pixels on the bottom, so I'll just write that. I could have written padding left, 20%, padding right, 20%, but it's quicker just to use the shorthand. So now you can see that my content is not going to go right to the edge. I'm going to have quite a bit of space here, which is what I want. And then when it gets to the 1200 pixels or less, it will take up the full width until it hits the media query that we specified. In this way, we've built out a nice responsive navigation. It switches depending on the layout that we're looking at, and we did some things using a lot of the properties that we've been talking about throughout this course: flex, grid, position, all kinds of things. So needless to say, I hope you enjoyed this exercise, and now you know how to build out a responsive navigation for mobile and for large screens.